The room was full and loud and warm with the specific warmth of a family gathering that has been performing well for several hours. I was standing near the window with a glass of wine, watching it the way I watched most things, with the particular attention of someone who had spent 20 years training herself to observe before speaking and to speak only when the observation was complete. My grandmother's birthday, 82 years. The kind of milestone that pulls the entire family into one space regardless of what the members of that family actually think of each other when the milestone is not present to organize them. I had not been in this space for 20 years. I had come for one person. Then Caleb's voice came across the room, loud enough to be heard clearly above the ambient conversation, shaped with the specific carry of someone who had calibrated their volume for an audience. "So, after 20 years, you still haven't done anything big." The room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when someone has said something that requires a social response and the group is waiting to see which direction the response takes. People turned. I felt the turning without looking at it. I took a sip of wine. Then I said, quietly and without any particular emphasis, "Not everything is announced early." I said it in the specific tone of someone making a factual observation rather than delivering a line. Nobody in the room understood what I meant. Nobody in that room was supposed to. I looked at my brother across the space between us, and I saw his face arrange itself into the smirk of someone who has made a public point and has interpreted the response as a failure to produce a counterpoint, which was not what had happened, but which was what he needed to believe had happened. I let him believe it. But before I tell you why that sentence meant what it meant, I need to take you back, because the party is not where this started. Before I do that, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and your local time. I want to know who is in this room with me tonight. Now let me take you back. My name is Sophia. I'm 37 years old. I grew up in a house in Columbus, Ohio, that had the surface structure of a functioning family and the interior architecture of something considerably less functional. My father, Robert, was the kind of man who was present in the physical sense and absent in every other. He occupied chairs and ate meals and drove to and from places and produced the basic, observable behaviors of a father without generating the substance of one. He was not cruel. He was in the specific way that can be more damaging than cruelty because it denies you even the clarity of a defined antagonist, simply not there in any way that mattered. My mother, Patricia, was more present. She organized and managed and maintained the family's social image with the specific intelligence of someone for whom image was the primary product. She cared about how things looked to the neighbors and to the extended family and to the parents of other children at the school, and within that system of caring, she distributed her attention and her warmth in the direction of whoever reflected the image most favorably. That was Caleb. He was 3 years younger than me, and from the time he was old enough to be compared to, I was compared to him unfavorably, not always loudly, sometimes just in the architecture of decisions. Who got driven to activities and who took the bus? Who got the new things and who got the functional things? Who was described to other adults at family gatherings in the warm, proud register of someone presenting evidence of their own success as a parent? I understood the dynamic by the time I was 10. By 12, I had stopped expecting it to change. By 15, I was working after school at a diner 4 nights a week, not because I had to in the strict financial sense, but because the money I earned was money that had no conditions attached to it, which was a form of freedom I had decided was worth the hours. By 17, after a specific accumulation of specific incidents that I am not going to detail here because the details are not the point, and the point is the pattern, I left. Not dramatically. I did not pack a bag and slam a door. I made a plan over the course of 3 months. I found a room I could afford on what I was making at the diner. I arranged for my final high school credits to be completed through an alternative program. I told my grandmother what I was doing the night before I did it, because she was the only person in that house who had ever looked at me with the specific attention of someone who saw me as I actually was, rather than as the family's less favorable comparison point. She held my hand and said, Be careful." I said I would. I left on a Tuesday morning before anyone else was awake. The 20 years between that Tuesday and the party are not a story of continuous suffering. I want to be clear about that, because people sometimes hear about a difficult beginning and fill in the middle with a narrative of ongoing struggle, and that is not what happened. What happened was work. Sustained, unglamorous, precisely organized work. Hotel cleaning for 8 months. Overnight bookkeeping at a shipping office for 2 years while I finished community college on a schedule that required sleeping less than was healthy. A move to Chicago for a junior analyst position at a small investment firm where I was the youngest person and the only person who had not attended a traditional 4-year college, and where I spent 18 months understanding the job at a depth that was visible to exactly 2 people, one of whom was the firm's founder. That founder's name was Marcus Webb, and he was 60 at the time, and he had the specific quality of someone who had built something real and knew the difference between people who understood that and people who understood the appearance of it. He offered me a development role. I took it. I learned from him for 4 years with the focused attention of someone who understands that the person in front of them has something irreplaceable to teach. Marcus retired 7 years ago. Before he did, he gave me first right of refusal on a portfolio of interests he was divesting. I had been preparing for that conversation for 3 years. I bought the portfolio. I restructured it over 2 years. I used the restructured portfolio as the foundation for what became Hartwell Global Holdings. Hartwell was my grandmother's maiden name. She didn't know that until 6 months after I registered it. I did not tell my family about any of this, not out of secrecy exactly, out of the specific detachment that develops when you have spent enough years building something without anyone's help that the people who once dismissed you become simply irrelevant to the work. Not enemies, not targets, just people who occupied a different context that no longer intersected with your daily life in any meaningful way. I thought about them occasionally the way you think about weather from a previous city, not with longing or resentment, just as a fact of earlier geography. My grandmother called me on the first Sunday of every month. That was our arrangement, established in my first year away and maintained without interruption for 2 decades. She asked about my work in the way she asked about everything, with genuine interest and zero pretense of understanding more than she understood. I told her what I could in language that was honest without being detailed. She told me about the family in the specific register of someone who is reporting rather than editorializing, which was one of the many things I loved about her. She mentioned the birthday party in January. She said she would understand if I didn't come. I said I would be there. I drove from New York on a Saturday morning and I parked on the street outside the house I had left on a Tuesday 20 years ago, and I sat in the car for approximately 2 minutes. Then I went inside. The party had been running for 3 hours by the time Caleb made his comment. I had spent those 3 hours doing the thing I was best at in rooms like this, which was moving through the social architecture without generating friction while paying attention to everything. I noticed my mother's practiced warmth when she greeted me, which was the warmth she used for guests rather than the warmth she used for family, which told me that I had been recategorized over the years in a way she found more comfortable than the alternative. I noticed my father's handshake, which was the handshake of a man who is genuinely unsure what the correct gesture is for a daughter he has not seen in 2 decades and has selected the neutral option. I noticed Caleb immediately. He was standing in the center of the room with the particular presence of someone who has arranged to be at the center of the room and is comfortable there. He was well dressed in the way that is about signaling rather than aesthetics. He spoke loudly enough to include the people around him without appearing to be performing for them, which was a social skill he had always had and which had clearly developed with practice. He saw me come in. Something moved across his face very briefly. Then it resolved into the expression I remembered, the one that had always been there underneath the sociability, the one that said the comparison had been running continuously, even in my absence, and had been continuously resolved in his favor by default. He did not come to greet me. He waited. For 3 hours he maintained his position at the center of the room, and I maintained my position at the edges of it, and the gravitational logic of the party kept us separate until the specific moment he chose to change that. So, after 20 years, you still haven't done anything big. The room went quiet. I took a sip of wine. Not everything is announced early. He smirked. The room recalibrated, and I looked over his left shoulder at the gift bags stacked near the entrance, the ones his company had apparently sponsored, bearing the Sterling Consumer Group logo in the specific sans serif font that had been in the due diligence documents on my desk 3 weeks ago. I looked at the logo, I looked at my brother, I took another sip of wine, and I thought about the acquisition that was scheduled to close in 14 days. And I said nothing, because not everything is announced early, and some things, when they are finally announced, change every room they have ever been in. I drove back to New York on Sunday morning. The drive was 4 hours, and I spent the first hour thinking about the party, and the last 3 hours thinking about Monday and what Monday required of me. That ratio, 1 hour for the personal, 3 for the professional, was not a conscious allocation. It was just how my mind organized things after 20 years of practice. The party had given me 2 pieces of information I had not had before. The first was that my family's understanding of who I was had not updated in my absence. They had formed a version of me at 17, difficult, ambitious in a way that was framed as delusion, someone who had left without the resources to build anything real. And they had maintained that version through 2 decades of no contact, adding to it occasionally from whatever minimal information had filtered through. The version they held was consistent and settled and completely wrong. The second was the logo on the gift bags. Sterling Consumer Group. I had seen that logo many times in the past several months, but I had seen it in a context that did not include my brother standing in the center of a party room beneath it. Seeing it there, in that specific juxtaposition, had produced a clarity I had not expected to feel until the acquisition closed. I understood now what I had understood intellectually, but not viscerally, before that moment. Caleb worked for a company I was about to own, not as an employee, not as a partner. As the controlling authority, I had not targeted Sterling because of Caleb. I want to be precise about that because the precision matters both legally and personally. Hartwell Global Holdings had identified Sterling Consumer Group as an acquisition target 14 months ago through a standard portfolio analysis process managed by my investment team. The strategic rationale was straightforward. Sterling had valuable regional infrastructure and a client base that complemented 2 of our existing holdings, and its current leadership had been underperforming against those assets for 3 years. Caleb's name had appeared in the organizational chart during due diligence. Operations Executive, Regional Division. I had noted it. I had disclosed it to Daniel Mercer, my board chairman, as a potential conflict of interest. Daniel had reviewed the disclosure and determined that a personal relationship with a mid-level operations executive did not constitute a material conflict given the structure of the acquisition. He had noted it in the board minutes and we had proceeded. I had not told Caleb. There was no obligation to tell him. He was not a party to the transaction. He was an employee of a target company, one of hundreds, and the acquisition had been conducted under standard confidentiality protocols that applied to all Sterling employees regardless of their personal connections to anyone at Hartwell. I had not arranged for his name to be in the org chart. I had not arranged any of what was about to happen. I had simply done the work, and the work had its own logic. And the logic was currently moving toward a conclusion that none of the people in my grandmother's living room could have anticipated. The acquisition closed on a Wednesday. It closed the way significant transactions close when they have been properly prepared, which is quietly and procedurally and with the specific anticlimactic efficiency of a process that has been moving toward its endpoint for 14 months and has arrived there without the drama that people who are not involved in these processes tend to imagine. I was in the office at 7 that morning. I signed the final documents at 9:42. By 10:15 it was done, and I was in a meeting about the integration timeline, and by noon I was eating a sandwich at my desk and reviewing the due diligence summary that my team had compiled on Sterling's executive population. The summary was where I found the full picture of Caleb. Not all of it had been visible at the org chart stage. The detailed HR review, which was a standard component of executive due diligence for any acquisition of this size, had surfaced information that the previous Sterling leadership had managed quietly. 3 formal HR complaints filed against Caleb by members of his regional team over an 18-month period. The complaints documented a pattern of behavior that included intimidation, misuse of his authority in performance review processes, and expense account irregularities that had been flagged by Sterling's internal finance team and then not pursued. Not pursued because the person responsible for pursuing them had reported to someone who had a relationship with Caleb's division that made the pursuit uncomfortable. That was the specific way these things worked in organizations that had been poorly managed. Not conspiracy, just the accumulated weight of 100 small decisions to avoid conflict, each one individually defensible and collectively producing a culture where certain people understood they were insulated from consequences. Hartwell's acquisition had ended that insulation. Daniel called me at 2 p.m. He had reviewed the HR summary independently, as was his responsibility as board chairman. He said the findings required a formal executive review process to be initiated through the compliance function. He said the review would be conducted by an independent firm with no prior relationship to Sterling. He said the results would be reported to the full board before any personnel decisions were finalized. He also said, with the specific care of someone who understood the situation completely, "Sophia, you need to formally recuse yourself from any involvement in this review. The conflict of interest disclosure we noted at the board level becomes more significant now that the specific executive has documented issues. I need you completely out of this process for your own protection and for the integrity of the review." I said, "I understand." He said, "I mean completely, Sophia. No review of the reports, no conversations with the compliance team about this specific matter, nothing that could be characterized as personal involvement." I said, "I understand, Daniel." He said, "Good, because the review is going to find what it finds, and the board is going to decide what it decides, and I need that process to be completely clean." I said, "It will be." I hung up. I looked at the due diligence summary on my desk. I read it once more carefully, with the specific attention of someone who has been told they will not be reading it again. Then I put it in the folder designated for the compliance team, and I did not touch it again. But I want to tell you what I had already read, because I had read it before Daniel called. And what I had read had reframed 20 years of a very specific question that I had stopped asking out loud but had never entirely stopped carrying. The question was whether Caleb was simply the product of a family system that had rewarded his behavior, or whether the behavior itself was something he had chosen consistently regardless of the rewards. The HR complaints answered that question. The people who had filed them were not people who had grown up in my family. They were strangers, professional colleagues, people with no connection to anything personal. They had simply worked for Caleb and had documented, in the careful and frightened language of people who understand that filing a complaint against a senior executive carries risk, what it had been like to be on the receiving end of his authority. Reading those documents was not satisfying in the way that people sometimes imagine vindication is satisfying. It was clarifying. The behavior was not a product of the family system. The family system had simply provided the first audience for it. The acquisition became public on Thursday morning. The press release was standard. Hartwell Global Holdings announces completion of acquisition of Sterling Consumer Group, strategic rationale, integration timeline, leadership transition details. My name was in the second paragraph as CEO of Hartwell. By 10 o'clock, my phone had received 4 calls from numbers I recognized from the Columbus area code. I did not answer any of them. I was in a meeting about the Sterling integration timeline, and the calls went to voicemail, and I did not listen to the voicemails until Friday afternoon. My mother's voicemail was composed, which was consistent with who she was. She said she had seen the news and that she wanted to talk, and that she was proud of me, which was a sentence she had not previously produced in my presence in 37 years. My father's voicemail was brief. He said, "Call me when you get a chance." There was a voicemail from a number I did not recognize that turned out to be an aunt who had been at the birthday party and had apparently found the situation more interesting than the family had intended. And there was a voicemail from Caleb. Caleb's voicemail was not composed. He had clearly recorded it immediately after seeing the press release, without giving himself time to organize his response. His voice was doing the specific thing voices do when the person producing them is experiencing something they did not see coming and have not yet had the chance to manage. A tightness, a breath quality that was different from normal speech. He said my name twice. Then he said he needed to talk to me. Then he said he had seen something at work and he didn't understand it and he needed to talk to me before he called anyone else. He did not say what the something was. He did not need to. I knew what it was. The executive review notice had been issued to the relevant parties by the compliance firm Thursday morning, concurrent with the public announcement. It was standard timing. These things were coordinated carefully to ensure the individuals under review were notified through proper channels before any external information made the review more difficult to manage. Caleb had received his notice Thursday morning, and then he had seen the press release, and then he had called me. I listened to the voicemail twice. Then I put my phone face down on my desk, and I sat with the specific feeling of someone who has arrived at a moment they did not plan but also cannot pretend they did not see coming. I had not targeted him. I had not arranged for his name to be in the compliance file. I had not done anything except complete a legitimate business acquisition that my team had identified for legitimate business reasons. What I had done 14 months ago was the work, and the work had arrived at its conclusion with all the logic and inevitability of something that was always going to end this way once the right structure was in place. I thought about Harold. I thought about my grandfather's letter from the yacht story, and then corrected myself because this was not that story. This was my story. I thought about Marcus Webb and 4 years of learning from someone who understood the difference between real work and the performance of it. I thought about diner shifts and hotel cleaning and overnight bookkeeping and community college completed on a schedule that required sleeping less than was healthy. I thought about a party room with a gift bag bearing a logo I recognized. And I thought about my brother's voice on a voicemail he had recorded before he understood the full shape of what he was in. He had called me before he called anyone else, which meant that somewhere beneath the executive title and the loud certainty and the 20 years of being the comparison point, he understood something that he had not been willing to acknowledge in a room full of family. He understood that the sentence he had said across a party room on Saturday had landed in a very different way than he had intended. Not everything is announced early. He was starting to understand what I had meant. He just did not yet know how much of it there was still left to understand. I picked up my phone. I did not call him back, not yet, because there was still one more thing he needed to find out before we had that conversation, and he was going to find it out on Friday morning, when the board met and voted. Caleb called on Saturday morning, 2 days after the party, 2 days after. Not everything is announced early had landed in a room full of people who assumed they understood what it meant. I was at my desk when the call came. Not because I was waiting for it, because Saturday mornings at my desk were a habit I had built over 20 years and had not seen a reason to change. The work did not observe weekends, and I had long since stopped expecting it to. His name appeared on my screen. I let it ring twice. Then I answered. His voice was different from the voicemail. The voicemail had been unorganized, the voice of someone recording before they had given themselves time to compose. 2 more days had given him time to compose. But underneath the composition was something that could not be fully managed, a quality of tightness, of controlled breath, of someone who had spent 48 hours trying to understand a situation and had arrived at the call without having done so. He said my name. I said Caleb. He said, "Why is my name on that notice?" He said it in the specific tone of someone who has rehearsed the question and is delivering it with the authority they have decided the question requires. Not quite a demand, not quite a question. The tone of someone who believes they are owed an explanation and is trying to collect it without appearing to need it. I said, "What notice are you referring to?" A pause. He said, The executive review notice from the compliance firm. My name is on it. I said, I see. He said, what did you say to my boss? I said, I didn't say anything to your boss. A longer pause. Then I said, I don't have a channel to say anything to your boss, Caleb. I don't communicate with Sterling's operational leadership directly. He said, what do you mean you don't? And then he stopped because he had heard the sentence properly. Sterling's operational leadership, not your company, not where you work. Sterling Consumer Group, which is a company with operational leadership that Sophia Hartwell does not communicate with directly, because Sophia Hartwell sits above that structure entirely. I heard the breath change on the other end of the call. I said, I bought the company. Silence. Pure and complete silence. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, the silence of someone whose entire understanding of a situation has just been restructured in a single sentence and who requires a moment to locate themselves within the new structure. Then his breath, heavy, broken. The specific quality of breath that happens when the body responds to information before the mind has finished processing it. I said, the acquisition closed on Wednesday. It was public Thursday morning. The compliance review was initiated through standard post-acquisition due diligence. Your name appeared in the review because the due diligence process identified HR complaints that the previous Sterling leadership had not pursued through proper channels. He said, you did this. I said, the acquisition was identified 14 months ago by my investment team. The strategic rationale had nothing to do with you. Your name appeared in due diligence because your name was in the documentation. He said, you did this because of the party. I said, Caleb, the acquisition timeline started 14 months ago. The party was 6 days ago. Silence again. I let it be silent. Then I said, I recused myself from the compliance review process the day the due diligence summary was finalized. I had no involvement in the notice you received. That came from the independent compliance firm reporting directly to the board. He said, the board. I said, yes. He said, you're on the board. I said, I chair the board. Another silence. This one had a different quality, not the silence of processing, the silence of someone who has arrived at the full shape of something and is standing in it. I said, the board will vote on the compliance findings next week. I will not be in the room for that vote. Daniel Mercer will chair it in my place. Whatever the board decides will be decided on the basis of the documented findings, not on anything personal. He said, Sophia. I said, I have to go, Caleb. I have a meeting. I hung up. I sat at my desk in the quiet of my office on a Saturday morning, and I looked at the skyline through the window and I thought about what I felt, which was not what people might expect. Not triumph, not the warm satisfaction of a score settled, not the particular pleasure of having delivered a line that landed correctly. What I felt was the specific and quiet feeling of something that had been pending for a long time arriving at its natural completion. Not a conclusion I had engineered, a conclusion the situation had been building toward with its own logic, and which had arrived now because the structures were finally in place to allow it. The board met the following Thursday. Daniel chaired it. I was not in the room. I sat in my office with the door closed, and I worked on a separate matter for 3 hours, while the board reviewed the compliance findings and deliberated and voted. Daniel knocked on my door at 11:47. He came in and sat across from my desk and said, the vote was unanimous. He said it without elaboration because he knew I understood what unanimous meant in this context. Caleb's executive title, stock options, pending performance bonuses, and all associated compensation structures were terminated effective immediately, consistent with the misconduct provisions of his employment agreement. The compliance findings were being referred to the relevant external authorities given the nature of the expense account irregularities. Sterling's legal team would be in contact with him through the appropriate channels. I said, thank you, Daniel. He said, you handled this correctly. I want you to know that. There are a lot of people who would have handled it differently. I said, I know. He left. I looked at the window for a long moment. Then I opened the document I had been working on for 3 weeks, which had nothing to do with Caleb and everything to do with the reason I had named the company Hartwell in the first place. The press release went out on a Friday. Hartwell Global Holdings announces the establishment of the Evelyn Hartwell Foundation, a scholarship program supporting teenagers experiencing housing instability and family disruption in their pursuit of educational and professional opportunity. Initial funding of $2 million drawn from acquisition profits. Applications open to young people aged 16 to 22 in regions served by Hartwell's operational portfolio. My grandmother's name. On a foundation, funded by the acquisition. I had not called my family before it went out. I had not coordinated with anyone in Columbus about the language or the timing or the fact of it. I had simply done it the way I had done everything for 20 years, which was without announcement and without permission and with the specific confidence of someone who had learned a long time ago that the work did not require anyone's approval to be real. The press release went public at 9 on a Friday morning. By 10:30, my grandmother had called. I answered on the first ring. She was quiet for a moment after I said hello. Then she said my name, and there was something in the way she said it that I had not heard since she held my hand the night before I left. She said, "You used my name." I said, "It's your name. You gave it to me." She said, "Sophia." I said, "I know, Grandma." We stayed on the phone for 20 minutes without saying much. That was fine. We had always been comfortable in the specific quiet of people who understood each other well enough that silence was not absence. I drove to Columbus 2 weeks later, not to the family house, not to the party location, to my grandmother's apartment, the one she had moved to 4 years ago when the house became too much to manage, with the small kitchen and the window that looked out onto a parking lot and the particular orderliness of someone who had spent 82 years learning what actually needed to be kept. I brought coffee. She was already sitting at the table when I came in. She looked at me the way she had always looked at me, with the specific attention of someone who sees the person in front of them, rather than the role that person occupies in their understanding of the family system. She said, "Sit down." I sat. She poured her coffee and wrapped her hands around the cup and looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I always knew you'd leave that house someday. I just prayed you'd survive it." I said, "I did more than survive it." She said, "I know. I read about it." She smiled in the specific way she had always smiled, which was the smile of someone who found the world interesting and was willing to say so. "Your grandfather would have liked what you built." I said, "He's the reason I named it Hartwell." She said, "I know that too." I sat with her for 2 hours. We talked about real things, about the foundation and what it would actually do for the people it was meant to reach, about the work, which she asked about with genuine curiosity, about the 20 years, which we were both willing to acknowledge had existed without needing to spend significant time narrating them. Before I left, she held my hand the way she had held it the night before I left at 17. She said, "You didn't need any of us, but I hope you know you always had me." I said, "I always knew." I drove back to New York. 3 months after the board vote, the investigations had resolved into the specific procedural outcomes that investigations resolve into. When the documentation is clear and the findings are unambiguous, plea agreements, restitution requirements, the quiet administrative collapse of a reputation that had been built on the assumption of insulation. My mother called twice during those 3 months. The calls were composed. She had always been composed. She said she wanted to understand. She said she was proud of me. She said the word proud in the specific way of someone for whom the word had arrived late and was trying to compensate for the lateness through emphasis. I was polite. I was not warm, not because I had decided to be cold, because the warmth she was reaching for required a shared history that did not exist in the form she needed it to exist in. And I had decided, somewhere in the process of building everything I had built, that I was not responsible for constructing that history retroactively. I walked through the Hartwell Global Headquarters lobby on a Tuesday morning 3 months after the acquisition, and the employees I passed said good morning with the specific respect of people who understand that the person greeting them has earned the position she holds. Above the main wall in the lobby, the company name in clean letters. Hartwell Global Holdings. My grandmother's name. my company, my life, built without any of them. So here is what happened, in plain language. I left home at 17 with no support and no safety net. I worked diner shifts and hotel rooms and overnight offices, and I completed my education on a schedule that required everything I had. I built a career, and then a firm, and then a company that became Hartwell Global Holdings. I went to my grandmother's birthday party after 20 years, and my brother said I had never done anything big, and I said not everything is announced early. I drove back to New York, and on Wednesday, the acquisition closed, and my brother's name appeared in a compliance review that my team had initiated through standard due diligence. The board voted unanimously. I recused myself from the process. I announced a foundation in my grandmother's name. I drove to Columbus and sat with the only person in that family who had ever looked at me clearly. And then I came home. That is the whole story. Now here is what I want to leave with you. Silence is not failure. Privacy is not weakness. The people who interpret your quiet as evidence of your limitations are telling you something important about the limits of their own imagination. For 20 years, my family held a version of me that had stopped updating the day I left at 17. They were not unusual in this. People build models of the people around them and maintain those models long after the actual person has moved beyond them. The model is easier than the updating. The updating requires attention and humility and the willingness to be wrong about something you have been certain of for a long time. My family was not willing, so the model stayed, and I built something too large to fit inside it. The second thing, what happened to Caleb was not revenge. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I did not target him. I did not orchestrate his circumstances. I did the work I had always done, with the standards I had always maintained, and those standards created a structure that could not accommodate what he had been doing. That is not revenge, that is consequence. There is a difference. Revenge requires you to organize your life around someone else's behavior. Consequence arrives when you organize your life around your own standards, and those standards are high enough that the people who assumed you were nothing cannot survive contact with them. Build to your standards. The rest takes care of itself. I want to end today not with a question, but with something my grandmother said as I was leaving her apartment in Columbus. I had reached the door, and she said, from her chair at the table, without looking up from her coffee, "They spent 20 years treating you like you'd never become anything. They just never realized you were building something too big to explain at a family party." I turned around. She was looking at me with that smile. I said, "How did you know?" She said, "I always knew. I just waited for you to know it too." I closed the door behind me. I drove back to New York, and I have thought about that sentence every day since. Tell me in the comments your first name and your city. Tell me if you have ever been the quiet one in the room who was building something nobody around you had the language for. I want to know who is at this table. Subscribe if you want to stay for the next one. There is always another story, and it always belongs to the person who kept building when everyone else stopped watching.